here. Tell us when. Okay, are we ready? My mic's on, so I guess we are. I guess no more whispering to the to the crew up here. All right, everyone. Ambassador Kionka, I'll wait for her to sit down and think of her question for my panel. All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this first on-the-record panel of the last day of the Lennart Meri conference. Thank you so much to the organizers for having us, and to my panel for being here, and to those of you watching online as well. We're very happy to have you. So my panelists today for this subject, can we, whoever we is in this case, turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake? And we are also going to be discussing whether we'd even want to. My panelists are the Defense Minister of Sweden, Paul Jonsson, the Chief of the German Navy, Vice Admiral Jan Christen Kaak, Estonia's ambassador to NATO, well known with this crowd, Juri Luik, and Peter Viggo Jakobsen, an associate professor at the Royal Danish Defence College. Thank you all for being here. So as we all know in this room, Sweden's very eagerly, counted by the minute, accession to NATO, literally by the minute, has given the alliance unprecedented prowess in and around the Baltic Sea. More accessibility, but also more responsibility. With Kaliningrad now isolated in NATO territory, will that provoke Russia into more hybrid attacks than we've already seen, although not all of those have been attributed to the Kremlin, and we'll talk about that as well. How can NATO maximize its potential in the region, keep peace, and protect its allies? That's what we're going to examine this morning. And I'm going to start with the Swedish Defense Minister, whom I believe is among the people who aren't particularly fond of the term Baltic Lake. NATO lake. NATO lake? No, Baltic Lake. We can be a Baltic Lake. And I'm already misspeaking. Okay, he likes Baltic Lake, not NATO lake.
Swedish lake?
And you can address that if you want. But,
Sure.
but more importantly, and I really hate that this feels like a softball, because I tried to find a better way to start, but I will have to start this way.
Okay.
To talk about how getting Sweden's very highly prized naval assets and so on changes NATO's geostrategic calculus in the north. And yes, it's a softball, but it is the umbrella question to open our panel. You're welcome for that.
Thank you very much.
That's where it ends.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for the invitation. Great to be back. I've been here many times, but first time in this capacity as well. Very much appreciate the conference and all the interaction. Few words then just to grapple with the question: is it Baltic Sea or the NATO Sea and so forth? I mean, what we're standing up for and defending is the rules-based international order. And in the rules-based international order, we start what's important for us, and that's freedom of navigation and it's safe sea lines of communications. So I think we should have that at the forefront on how we also approach the Baltic Sea. Now, of course, with Sweden and Finland inside NATO, that consolidates the whole northern flank and it redraws the map. And of course, it's all going to be based now on NATO's new regional plans as well. And we're laser focused now on making sure that these regional plans are executable. And then, so if that's the overriding picture, then so what in the maritime dimension does the Swedish NATO membership matters? Well, we have a very long coastline, about 2,600 kilometers. We've been operating in the Baltic Sea in all domains for many, many decades, and I would claim that we have a fleet that is very Baltic-centric. We don't have a blue sea navy, but we're operating in the Baltic Sea, which with an average depth of 55 meters, with braced water, as it's called, as a special kind of conditions. We operate, of course, with our submarines, which we're going from 4 to 5. We've invested also into our air defense capabilities on our 9 surface combatants, and we're also acquiring 4 new ones as well. We've been operating in the air with our airborne sensors and our intelligence capabilities. And on Thursday, the government made an announcement tasking the Swedish armed forces to report in our whole wartime organization into NATO. And when I speak to Sakur, he says there's 2 areas where Sweden should feel a special kind of responsibility, but also obligation in developing our capabilities. And one is up in the high north, when we are coordinating our subarctic capabilities on the ground forces between Sweden, Finland, and Norway. We exercise that with Nordic Response, as you might know. But the other one is the Baltic Sea, because we have a quite Baltic Sea-centric approach to our force posture and our presence in the region. And I think those are some of the assets and capabilities that we also can help us to be a security provider within the lines.
I thought you were going to talk about your diving experience.
No.
No?
I used to be a combat diver, but that was 30 years ago.
We're going to talk about how difficult the water
the
is.
visibility in the water is
Exactly.
horrible.
I do my research. Okay, Vice Admiral Koch, lots more cooks in the kitchen now, right? So is this difficult now for NATO to integrate more countries? I mean, it's what they looked forward to. God knows they were waiting to get these Swedish assets and the Finnish ones as well. We shouldn't leave out our very close Finnish friends. How now is the naval capabilities of NATO going to be integrated and run? Who's the boss?
Well, let's be honest, and thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts. Finland and Sweden had been long-time friends, and now they became allies. For me, it's a personal dream, because we have built on that since 2015, when we opened a special cooperation at the Baltic Sea. Today, you see a cooperation that is unmatched in any other region I know, with partnerships between combat squadrons, with exercises open to everybody. We have our own exercise, Northern Coast, and we have a close knowledge of each other, which I call you need to know people before you need people. Which then, at the end, when the Russians crawled over the wall, costed me 3 telephone calls, a quick flight with an MPA to Finland to understand what our partners in the east needed, and then to order the German fleet everything that swims goes out to the east to signal that we are there and that we stand for NATO's promise of one for all and all for one. May I also add something on the NATO lake?
You please do.
So it is not, and it will hardly ever be achieved, especially with regard to the growing Russian capabilities and gray zone activities on the seabed. And furthermore, this wording gives room for misinterpretation, I think, by conveying a false sense of security. Why should we bother if it's a NATO lake? So let's call it what it really is, a confined and shallow water space which is home to the lifelines of the Baltic states and Finland, and it's also a challenging security environment where our ships sail and act in direct vicinity of our potential adversaries, who will always have the initiative. And let's not deceive ourselves. The Russian Navy will come out of this war strengthened, because
it's largely been left alone, right?
Well, don't focus too much on what's happening in the Black Sea. What we see is an unstopped building rate of modern ships with sophisticated weapons. What we also see is an investment in underwater communication, underwater navigation, and underwater effects, and that's kind of frightening in some ways, and I can elaborate on that later on. And what you see in the area here is GPS jamming, GPS spoofing, and probing of our critical maritime infrastructure. Consequently, we should ask ourselves how to increase security together and what we can do to protect ourselves from the hybrid attacks in the Baltics. Let me point out 2 points.
See, I've been very strict with them on the time. You can see Vice Admiral's asking me for permission to speak. Yes, Vice Admiral, you may give a couple more minutes.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to mention deterrence by attribution. Especially in the underwater domain, challenges have grown in recent years, as evidenced by the attacks in 2002 and the Baltic Connector incident. And they have 22. They have demonstrated the growing complexity. Thus, the need for appropriate situational awareness, surface and subsurface, becomes glaringly obvious, and the importance of swift information sharing between the nations and close coordination between the governmental, military, and private sector is highlighted. For Germany, the establishment of an underwater situation center will address this. And what we're going to do is to correlate the existing recognized maritime picture, where we're getting better, with civilian and military and intelligence information to get rid of the white spaces, surface and subsurface, including the use of military and civilian data from satellites, which we call from seabed to space.
Who's we when you say this? I mean, are you talking about the NATO coordination cell?
No, the NATO coordination center is really boosting the whole theme. But at the end, NATO will look at the nations, what they are doing. So this is speaking for me, but this should be then integrated into something, the leadership or a command structure that has to be built up in the Baltic Sea. Second point?
Okay. All right, but then...
Then I stop. Secondly, leadership, and I think that is interesting for all of you. Germany has agreed to take over more responsibility, which means that I'm just now awaiting confirmation by NATO to stand a regional maritime headquarters for the Baltic Sea, which we call Commander Task Force Baltic Headquarters, as part of the alliance's force structure in due time, and that should be new to everybody. And this builds on the capabilities and capacities of our already existing internationally sponsored battle staff German Maritime Force, work on important issues like the drafting of an operations order for the Baltic Sea, and aligning it with the national defense plans has already started. And I think that illustrates that we are not to despair, but rather to act. No, I'm
okay,
fine.
I could tell that's the end, because you reflected the theme of this year's conference. But what you mentioned, that the command, this new command, it's going to be situated in Germany. That's something that's already
correct.
decided, because that was new to NATO.
Well, actually, we
Watcher
came to an agreement with all neighboring nations that this headquarters should be stood up in Rostock, in our premises. They are already existing. They are fully working. Workshops are running on sustainment, maritime land integration, maritime strike, mass casualties. We're working on table toppings, and the next big thing, and that should be done very quickly, is the operations order for the Baltic. That's what everybody is looking for and really need.
Interesting. Okay, I think we will talk more about that, but now I will bring in Yuri. So this is the way it's working militarily on the ground, but back at NATO headquarters, you are also changing with the new regional plans and finally getting to integrate Sweden, which has again been long awaited at SHAPE. So how is this working with changing the regional calculations now that you finally have this basically seamless NATO presence around the Baltic Sea?
Well, let me say a couple of things in this regard, and Admiral covered some of them. I mean, I personally don't like the sort of epithet NATO lake, because it convenes stability, although the situation around our sea is very dynamic. And also it misses the point that Russia actually has serious assets around the Baltic Sea.
And the right to operate there.
Yeah, Kaliningrad, the St. Petersburg bases, but also, as you said, the right to operate, because there is an international waterway which runs through the Baltic Sea, and where we actually cannot do much to slow down Russia except in wartime situation. But in peacetime situation and in crisis time situation, Russians have a lot of options, like destroying the underwater infrastructure, and Admiral already described how difficult it is to attribute such actions, and how difficult it is to use armed forces to combat such actions. You know, the Baltic Sea is it's very narrow, it's inland sea, and actually when Estonians speak of their neighbors, they often say, well, Finns and Swedes, and of course Latvians. But actually, I mean, taken legally, Finns and Swedes are not our neighbors per se. I mean, there is the Baltic Sea, there is the Finnish Bay. We sometimes sort of forget it, but Russians don't forget it. For Russians, these are opportunities which they can use. Now, one of the reasons why underwater infrastructure is so tasty for Russians is that really the Baltic Sea is covered with it. The underwater infrastructure unites the whole Baltic region. Sweden, Finland are our main trading partners. Estonia is part of the Nordic energy ring, so we actually get most of our energy from the Nordic countries by pipelines. The same goes with communications. So for Russians, it's very easy to cut these links. And I mean, this is kind of the first serious capability they have. The second point goes to kind of, as you know, we are trying to limit Russian options to fight a war with the oil cap. Now, the Baltic Sea is the primary route out for Russian tankers. And these are not ordinary tankers, since we cannot allow that to happen. These are so-called shadow fleet tankers, tankers of minimum quality, a serious risk to the environment, and we cannot stop them. I mean, we could legally stop them, especially our Danish friends, because of the environmental aspects. But it is clear that this would be a serious international incident in international waters. So it takes a long time to make such a decision. When it comes to the military aspects of the new constellation of the so-called NATO lake, then we also have to be honest. I mean, the Finnish and Swedish membership has added a lot to our deterrence and defense, and obviously has reduced Russian options. It has serious deterrent power. There's no doubt about it. But the problem is that actually the balance of power has not necessarily changed regarding the risks which have been there and which will be there. For instance, the vulnerability of the Baltic states. I mean, when the war ends and Russians upgrade, and as you know, they have serious plans to upgrade their military capabilities close to Baltic borders, then they almost certainly have the same options and the same benefit of balance of power on their side. Now, there are certain assets which are difficult to use for Russians, especially the surface navy. I mean, clearly the movement of Russian ships has been made much more difficult because of Finnish and Swedish membership. We can effectively block it. But that's only one of the assets. There are many others. Nowadays, as you have seen, it's a missile war. It's a drone war. It's a war of sabotage. I mean, Russians have options which we have difficulties at the moment of combating. So if we want to seriously speak about the balance of power in favor of NATO as an alliance, a lot remains to be done.
Very interesting. He didn't ask any permission to keep going, did he, Admiral?
I'm sorry. I missed this point.
It was interesting. it was interesting. And I want to come back on the shadow fleet. It's a really important issue, and we have been talking about it here at the conference in terms of sanctions evasion, in terms of who can provide Russia with weapons, et cetera. But first, I would like Peter to come in. So you've listened to the officials talk about the capabilities and the challenges. So now, as someone who doesn't owe anything to a government to discuss, I mean, what do you make of the situation here, of Russia's, not just their capability, but perhaps their intention their motivation to increase these hybrid activities, and also particularly, well, I'll bring up Nord Stream after this. Go ahead.
Well, let me start out by saying I really like the term NATO lake.
Oh no, really?
And the reason I do is because, you know, the fact that Finland and Sweden has come into NATO has put a lot of NATO capability between Russia and Denmark. And what's not to like about that? There's also another great thing. Denmark has done away with its submarines, so we're really pleased that Sweden has come in and can help us out in that department. And if you actually look at the Danish capability to fight underwater, well, I would call it a work in progress. So in that sense, it's really nice from our perspective that we are part of this alliance and that Germany is stepping in and providing what you've just heard. If you look at the situation from a historic perspective, I would much rather be in the current situation than the situation I remember from when I grew up during the Cold War, when we were facing a formidable Soviet fleet with lots of allies and so on and so forth. And if I had to choose between being in the German admiral's shoes and a Russian admiral's shoes, I would definitely choose the German pair of shoes any day. I'm not saying this to say we do not have problems. I agree entirely with what we just heard from the previous speaker. But I don't think that we should, you know, become totally desolate because, I mean, right now, with the fighting that the Ukrainians are doing on our behalf, they're buying us time. And if we cannot spend this time about outspending and building up our capacities above water, underwater, in the Baltic Sea, so that we can cope with the Russians, then we're really to blame. So the problem is not so much us, the Russians, it's more us. And you asked about how do I expect the threat level to stay? Well, if you don't like the current situation, too bad, because that's the new normal. There's no way that Russia is going to dial down its attacks using hybrid sabotage, cyber attacks, and what have you, because they cannot compete in the conventional domain with us, which means that they have to beef up their nuclear deterrence, and they have to hit us below the surface. And as the situation in Russia deteriorates, and that would be my prediction for what we are looking at, Russia is not a rising power, they're a declining power, and the more they decline, the more desperate and risk-willing they're likely to get. So I think it's only going to get worse from now, which is why we really need to look seriously at how we address not only our undersea critical infrastructure, but the entire spectrum of what's happening in the hybrid or gray area domain.
I looked up something you've written lately, and one of the things that you said was you criticized your own government for paying more attention to Ukraine, unless you were misquoted in this article, for paying more attention to Ukraine's military than to your own. This was in a recent article where
Sure.
you were quoted. So
yes,
I mean,
yes.
I mean that could be misinterpreted, though. That perhaps you don't think that Denmark should have sent so much kit or money to Ukraine.
That was not my point. I've been on record saying again and again that I was very critical of Danish doing what you could call creative accounting. That we had a government that until about a month ago went around saying, oh, we're spending 2% too, isn't it great? Because we took our 1.3% of GDP that was spent on defense, and then we topped it up with Ukraine donations, and then we said, hey, we are doing 2% too. And I was trying to point out to our government that you don't really get to count that way, and nobody actually accepts it. And then I was told by the minister that was a very irrelevant discussion and very unwelcome discussion. But since we've just had a new defense agreement, our government has now decided to go to 2% of GDP spending on Danish defense by next year, and then we'll still keep up the donation. So now we're actually getting there. So my point is that you can actually count that way, and they just stop doing it. And it's probably not because of me. I'd rather expect that somebody in Washington or somebody in Brussels have been talking to our prime minister, but we're getting there, but way slowly.
There's also been some overly positive response to Denmark because people don't Google when they re-announce the howitzer donation, right?
I think that was really impressive. I'm pretty sure that
that was very impressive. But
the special advisor to the prime minister undoubtedly got a pay rise after she was able to sell our artillery donation to Ukraine twice.
Yeah, breaking news both times. Okay, would any of you like to address each other?
I would love to.
Paul was making noises.
Being a politician, knowing everything about creative bookkeeping. If NATO lakes, meaning NATO getting stronger in the Baltic Sea, I'm all for it. Rest assured, I want NATO to beef up presence, and I want to make sure that the Russians do not expand in any way. Crystal clear on that. And I very much concur also with what Yuri said. We should be laser focused also what the Russians are doing in the region, that they are investing into their naval capabilities, and we should not be just too centric on the Russian naval fleet in their Baltic naval fleet, because in reality they're operating with their naval forces in Murmansk. They go in and out the whole time. We see the Syrian Express as well, going from the Black Sea and coming to our region as well. We should also be cognizant that this is a region where at every time 24/7 there's about 4,000 vessels on the Baltic Sea. There's a lot of critical infrastructure as well. So I'd be the first to advocate a more focus on the Baltic Sea also for NATO, and making sure that NATO is strong when it comes to deterrence and defense. So I think we're quite aligned there. Yeah.
I actually Googled where NATO Lake came from when people first started using it, and I actually think it might be blamed on journalists because it was a clever headline, a cute way to put it. But then immediately the criticism started coming for reasons like this, that it indicated NATO was trying to declare more sovereignty over this water than is actually internationally legal, and also that, it was a bit arrogant. Yuri, I wanted to come back on a couple of things that you said, but I'm not sure that you're the one I'm going to ask about it. Attribution for undersea cable attacks. So a lot of journalists covering NATO, which I didn't introduce myself, but that's what I do, we eagerly awaited the results of the Swedish investigation. And then suddenly, and also the Danes, and then suddenly we were told that there weren't going to be any results that were shared with at least people like me. So why is that? And Yuri spoke quite openly about attribution and said Russia is doing this, but that nobody came to that conclusion on the Nord Stream 2 attack. So why not?
But we in Sweden we have the rule of law, and we have an independent judiciary. And if a prosecutor lands into the conclusion that he was unable to do an attribution, then we would listen to that. This did in very close collaborations also with the Danish authorities, who reached the same kind of conclusions. What I can say is that we learned a lot from Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, but also the Baltic connector. Yep. And I think that our ecosystems of how to handle these kind of attacks against critical infrastructure has evolved enormously. Just let me say 3 challenges that we are exposed to and which we need to grapple a lot with as well. And it's well known that Russia is investing into its capability of attacking critical infrastructure as well. And I welcome very much now that Marcom is setting up a center to handle these kind of challenges. One thing of the channels is this lawfare or is it warfare? Is this a matter in Sweden for the Coast Guard, the police, the security service, or the Navy?
Or all of the above?
All of the above. You're gonna have to have interagency collaboration if you want to be successful, because this is hybrid and it's a whole of government endeavor. The other one is, are you sure that you have the right laws and regulations into place in handling these things? I think that's room for improvement. And where do you allocate responsibility? A third point I would like to point to as well is a lot of this infrastructure is actually owned by private companies, entities. Do they also have a responsibility to this, or is this a public responsibility? So I think these 3 things that we've been exposed to have provided us with a steep learning curve. The other thing I took note on the 7th of October when this thing happened as well is how we coordinate ourselves internationally. And of course, we very much welcomed after the 7th of October, then NATO undertook vigilance activities, and SACEUR had the ability to do that, sending in more assets into the region in the maritime domain. That's stabilizing, that's not escalatory. But we also used the Joint Expeditionary Force into the region as well, activating this it's called GPRO 3.2. So we were coordinating a lot internationally as well. So lots of work to be done there, and our ecosystem has has improved due to these events that have taken place last 2 years.
Admiral, Germany also had an investigation into these attacks, and I haven't heard any conclusions there either.
No. But if I may, when I talk about attribution, deterrence by attribution, I mean, if the adversary knows that we know that he's operating there, then he might feel deterred to do anything. So that calls for a recognized maritime surface and subsurface picture. And we are building on that, as I mentioned in the beginning. We have come a long way nationally, but that needs to then interconnect it with the other nations. But ultimately, I fully underline what the minister just said. At the end, it's a question of who is allowed to do what, where, and when. And so my intent is to use NATO Center of Excellence for Operations in Confined and Shallow Waters based in Kiel. They do great legal conferences to focus on that aspect a little bit more, especially in Germany. That is not easy, as in some other nations as well. Just to give you an example, in the territorial waters, it's the responsibility of the local police. And in the EEZ, it's the federal police, but they don't have means for it. So as I will be responsible as soon as the first shot is fired, we try to set up scenarios, to go the whole thing through and then come to a good conclusion nationally. And then this needs to be added to the international frame as well.
Well, and as the minister pointed out, and as NATO constantly reiterated when we were asking them what they're going to do, these are commercial lines. And so what is we're not just talking about coordinating between countries, but also between business, between commercial companies and NATO or national military. So how does that work? And have they been more willing and are they seeking more coordination with you, because nobody can surveil all the entire undersea infrastructure?
Yeah, they are definitely seeking for it. So what we have at hand is one the picture on the surface, and we're getting better there. So, but then you need to use the information, the data we have in the underwater domain militarily, the information from industry, from intelligence agencies, and from research institutes. Everybody is willing to cooperate. How you organize that to bring that together, and then
Who pays for
my
it?
recommendation is give it to the Navy, because only we have the access to the intelligence information to make a proper assessment, and then provide this proper assessment to our government for a decision. And that's the way we are going forward with it.
And that's been acceptable to the business community who is...
That's acceptable. There are nations where legislation where it is mandatory to hand over the data, but it's in their best interest. And so the wind parks, for example, they all have sensors. So why not use the sensors for the better of a good underwater picture?
Okay, so speaking of business, I want to go back to the shadow fleet issue that you raised. Yuri, who is responsible? You pointed out what a big problem this is, and you said perhaps the Danes, and I will have Peter also come in on this, perhaps the Danes could stop the ships, but whose responsibility is it? It's because if there is an accident, and I looked up from the Allianz Insurance Company, and they say that there are frequent accidents with these ships. They're transferring crude at sea. They, of course, don't put these very old ships through proper inspections. They don't have proper insurance. So sure, you can say that maybe the Danes could stop the ships, but if there is a big spill or some other accident, it's going to affect you as well. So why does everybody say it's not us? Maybe the neighboring country could stop these ships? And maybe not even stop them, but
I will
on them.
Come to it, but I first make one note about the underwater critical infrastructure, because it's interconnected. These pipelines, they run through the international waters. So the most complicated part legally is the part which runs under international waters. There is a question: is it a sovereignty issue? Because if you attack a ship in international waters, there is a state flag, and you are responsible for state action against sovereignty of another state. If you attack an underwater infrastructure pipeline, then it's simply a commercial project. I mean, in strict legal terms, nobody can do anything other than, well, the pipeline company can give you to court sort of civilian debate, civilian case in the court system. So there's very little we can do, and this is related to the sovereignty issue. Now, the same actually, in a way, goes to the ships, because, as I said, there is international waterway. The ships are taking this waterway. To stop them militarily is an international incident. To stop them by police or environmental agencies, I mean, you basically can do it, but it has to be done where it is absolutely clear and provable that there is an immediate risk to security of this particular ship. And this is not so easy. The Admiral can also talk about it. And let's be honest, if we want to stop these ships, we have to go after the companies who sell these ships to Russians. And actually, these companies are known. These companies often come from the European Union countries, countries who have a lot of oil-carrying ships, and you can guess which countries they are, and which countries they are. And of course, the companies which help Russians to run these shadow ships. There are certain companies, trade companies. Basically, there is a possibility to go after them. But of course, these are companies which are not necessarily having a long shelf life. So it is, again, not the easiest way to do it. But, I mean, things can be done, but kind of imagining that we could just drive a warship in front of this row of tanker ships which runs in the on Baltic Sea is almost impossible. The other risk, and Paul Johnson can perhaps talk about it later, is really that these ships are doing what I think is called debunkering or bunkering,
exactly.
sort of exactly changing oil from other ship to the other one. And these areas are in the Swedish international waters. They are in the Estonian special economic zone, which are used for that kind of activity. Again, there is a massive environmental risk, but from the legal point of view, it's not very easy to stop such activities.
Okay, it may not be easy, but the EU and NATO have both done a lot of other things that aren't very easy when you're talking about taking capabilities and especially money out of Putin's pocket. So maybe it's not easy, but look how much money he's making from the crude business, even under sanctions. The oil cap has not been effective. So why are people not more incentivized? I'm not saying they're not, but I haven't seen it, to stop these ships no matter what, even besides the environmental risk.
Basically, we could take a much more aggressive posture. You are right.
Who should? But it's always like, who's we?
Well, in case of Estonia, we don't have much of a fleet to do that.
But you have a good aggressive posture.
But we can have an aggressive posture, but we have no ships. People who have ships have a less aggressive posture.
You just got a bunch more ships.
There's a paradox.
That's a valid excuse.
So there's a paradox here. But of course, as you said, EU has taken a much more aggressive posture on many, many things. So this is something which is also possible, but it means running serious risks. And it's not economic sanctions, it's actually physical risk of stopping ships.
Okay, I'm going to let Peter come in, and then if any of you would like to bring up other aspects of this.
But that's
someone
the
with
problem
ships.
about hybrid. I mean, and what we've been talking about here is that we are playing a game of catch-up. We are beginning to establish situational awareness so that we can detect attacks. And we are also beginning to get to a stage where we can attribute and say, hey, Russia did this, Russia did that. And once you got to that stage, then you have to decide, and how do you respond?
Yeah.
Right.
And when you start getting into that discussion, you also have to ask yourself, who has escalation dominance here? If we stop Russian ships, what are their next step and their step after that? And are we then getting into a situation that are a lot worse? Of course, we could stop ships in Denmark. But what if the Russians then decide to sabotage one of these oil ships so that we get a huge oil spill in the Baltic Sea? Now, you could say that it's already so polluted, so it doesn't matter that much. but I'm just saying that we need to think these things through.
But you're already risking oil spills as well by letting these crappy ships
but
sail through.
there's the risk of that happening, and then there's the risk of the Russians doing it deliberately to punish us. And then what do? They will just say, "Oh, that was a mistake, or that was an accident. It was an old ship with nothing to do with it." We know how they play these games, and it's the same with Nord Stream. I don't know who did the explosion, but I can understand why governments would be hesitant to attribute. There are three candidates out there: the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Now, if we realize I'm not saying they are, but if the Americans were behind it, it would be the end of the alliance if we made it public. If the Ukrainians were behind it, how on earth would Germany be able to continue to support Ukraine militarily? And if it's the Russians, how do we punish them? Should we start blowing up their pipelines and get into an escalation game there, or is that really not in our best interest? So we have to think these things through. And that's why it's easier said than done, that we can just stop these ships, because we need to have a comprehensive plan for how to respond to this. And that's why everybody's so hesitant about, how do we play this? And I guess the good answer to this is that we have to be much more resilient. We have to be better at making it very difficult to make successful attacks.
But this falls into the same trap of what people often criticize NATO and European leaders for doing, saying what we won't do. Well, we're afraid to figure out what we could do in case of these.
I'm not saying that we should not respond. I'm saying that we should have a plan for what happens after we've responded. What is the likely Russian response, and how to react to that? So we need to think it through and game it through. We make this escalation, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, this process should be underway, right, Admiral?
Yes, but as always, it should. So what keeps me awake at night? It's on the one hand to be ready if something happens, and our estimate is that we will have another 4 years. So we are counting back what we have to achieve. But the other thing, and latest since Gerasimov made his famous speech in 2013. The Secretary General Stoltenberg named it the dark side of the comprehensive approach. So hybrid warfare is something where we are really not good in understanding what's going on there, and there we need to become better too. And that's definitely going into the same direction as Peter was mentioning.
So, Minister, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just very briefly, we have a high situational awareness in the Baltic region, which means that we know exactly what ships we're talking about as well. Yuri was talking about them, some of them debunkering or bunkering just on the verge of the Swedish economic zone. This is a major ecological risk, I want to emphasize. Some of the quality of those ships leaves a hull which is much to desired by. We brought it up during the last EU ministerial meeting, the jumbo meeting, both myself and the foreign minister, that the EU need to do it. I brought it up in the NODEFCO. I think there is a unity of purpose among the Nordic Baltic countries in this regard, and I think it would be very natural that this would be covered by the 14th sanction package against Russia as well. So,
well, that's under discussion right now.
Absolutely.
Is it in there?
Yeah, well, it's not finalized. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Is it in there?
Well,
are they discussing it? It doesn't have to be final. We know what's in there. I know
Yeah.
there are some sanctions against media.
Well,
Russian
nothing is final until it's final, so I don't think the other ministers would appreciate if I go and pick out the shoes for it, but it's under deliberations at least.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good enough. Okay, I could keep going, as everyone can tell, but we have a lot of questions in the audience. I'm going to start over here because this man is one of the reasons I know a lot about the Shadow Fleet now. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And everyone, please introduce yourself, make your questions short and sharp so we can get a lot accomplished here. No, it doesn't sound like it.
So Ben Hilgenstock with that's better. Ben Hilgenstock with the Kiev School of Economics. Good morning. So I wanted to ask you about a proposal that has been made to get around the issue of interdicting Russian shadow fleet tankers, which is probably not a good idea and has escalation potential. So the idea would be this: you require adequate oil spill insurance for going through the Baltic Sea, going through the Gulf of Finland, going through the Danish Strait. And if a vessel does not provide that, or if the insurance is found to be inadequate, then you designate it. So you are not interfering with the right of innocent passage because the tanker can go through, but afterwards it will never do a business again. And this is essentially based on an approach that US Treasury, or OFAC specifically, has taken over the last 6 months, which is to designate specific vessels, which also gets around the problem that Ambassador Loic mentioned, that these management companies go away and pop up again. But if you sanction the vessel is essentially out of the market. And we see that with the 40 vessels that have been sanctioned, basically all of them are out of the market. So this would be the threat to force Russian oil back onto the mainstream fleet.
And would that not be escalatory? I mean, is this something that alleviates your concern that they would sabotage a ship purposely, Peter?
It would definitely be a better way of going about it, but you still have to physically stop the ship. So we'll see how that goes. But I mean, yeah, but that still is an issue. But that would be a way of addressing the problem, of course.
Okay, so Ben's saying you don't need to stop the ship because you can, designate it by Googling its IMO number, and did I remember that correctly?
Well, there is a database from the Protection and Indemnity clubs that provide the insurance, where you can check the insurance status based on the IMO number. And as Minister Johnson said, you know very well what ships are going through your territorial waters. So that would give you the insurance status. If that is found to be inadequate, then you designate the vessel. You don't need to stop the vessel for that. The vessel will just afterwards not do any business anymore, as we've seen with the 40 or so that have been designated.
With this much money going into Russia's pocket, again, I just have to repeat that. Is this something that would work? I mean, is this something that either of you think is a credible solution? You don't know?
Difficult to say.
Yeah, I don't, no? Okay. Anyone else? You want to say anything? No? Okay.
I
Okay.
think it's a good, interesting proposal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Rika Frank in the front row.
Thank you so much, Ulrike Franke from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I wanted to ask, how do you assess the threat from, or maybe the opportunities coming in the context of uncrewed naval vessels in the Baltic Sea? So it strikes me that we're going to see way more underwater and surface vessels that are uncrewed. Is that something that you think about? I guess this is primarily a question for the Vice Admiral. Is that something you're thinking about, how to defend against these? But also, what are the states, NATO, doing to use those assets in that context as well? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And that is absolutely in our mind. So we've just published a year ago the German Navigation Plan 2035 plus, which calls for a mix of conventional and unconventional units in all domains. So it follows the rationale that we will, for a very long time, still need big ships to be able to operate in the North Atlantic, to support and the convoys coming over, but to block nuclear submarines and hunt them in the north. But the nearer we come to the coast, the nearer we come to the threat, we want to go more optionally unmanned, so to put the people out of the loop of the threat. And our new concept calls for mass matters, and it would be an increase of, at least in the Baltics, of over 20 units that can be used for presence operations, manned with a very small crew. But if the first shot falls, it can be operate unmanned with a lot of awful things on board that could bring a dilemma to the adversary, and not the opposite.
And detection and defense against?
That's actually also it's part of the plan. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one from this side, this lady.
Thank you very much. I'm Katarina Tratch. I'm a senior fellow with the Stockholm Free World Forum. So my question is primarily directed to the Swedish Minister Paul Jonsson. I think we can all agree, and there's a lot of talk of the desire to increase the capabilities in the Baltic Sea region and also in the Arctic. And in this sense, the Swedish maritime capabilities have been seen as a very welcome addition to NATO. But at the same time, I just spoke to the colleague of the Vice Admiral, the Swedish chief of the Swedish Navy the other day, who frequently points out that the Swedish Navy is currently under-dimensioned for its current task. And now there's a new defense bill that is coming up in the Swedish parliament this fall. And the suggestion from the table from the Swedish Defense Committee is not really an addition to the Swedish Navy. It's not substantial for growth in the Swedish Navy. So I wonder if you could reflect upon that, Minister, and sort of the government stance on potential additional contributions to the Swedish Navy.
So if I understand correctly, the accusation is that you're not prepared already for national defense responsibilities, and now you're taking on other NATO responsibilities.
Well,
Correct.
that's the accusation.
That's how I phrased it.
But fair enough question, Katarina. A few things to be grappled with. Would I like more ships and a bigger navy? Yes, undoubtedly. Then we have to weigh in. We're doing quite substantial defense investment. We doubled our defense investment between 2020 and 2024. I think we were the third most inside the EU during those years, catching up after decades of underinvestments. And we have a trajectory now of going up to 2.6% of GDP by 2028. So there are substantial contributions, I think, on the financial side, which are absolutely necessary, and they're investments. Now, on our naval capabilities, of course, we have the 4 Luleå class, which will be about 5,000 tons. You can call surface competence with very competent air defense systems as well. And then we're investing into the mid-range air defense on the current Visby ones as well. There is additional money also, which I'm very glad for personnel for our surface competence as well, because I want a navy that's out at sea and and so personnel is a big challenge, and there's no problems for recruitment when it comes to the Swedish Navy. So there are additional measures being taken in order also to make sure that we can have a stronger naval presence. And I think with the Luleå class ones, we can also be a security provider also outside of the Baltic Sea. It goes a little bit in line with what the Finns are investing to as well, which I think they're going to be calling frigates as well. Because we of course going to be continuing being very focused on the Baltic Sea, but also when it comes to host nation support, we also have to be able to have a presence on the North Sea, and also to be able to provide other supports in line with the 360 approach. And the naval capabilities are the most, of course, agile in order to do that as well.
Well, he hasn't been shy about asking for money for the Swedish military. Let's be honest about that. Yuri, you wanted to say something on that?
Couple of points. First on ships. As the Admiral said, if we are talking about big ships, they are mainly useful in the Atlantic. In these shallow inland seas, there is a conceptual question now. I mean, you see Ukrainians keeping the Black Sea clean from Russian ships using drones, which are extremely cheap, and where you can actually sort of get much more bang for the buck, if that expression is good here. So the question of what you actually need in these inland seas is, I think, one of the questions we have to respond so that we will be more effective with less money. Yeah. The other issue is we are talking about sort of scenarios which are really considered sort of softer scenarios, like surveillance, like protecting underwater infrastructure. But let's go to the hard stuff. Let's talk about the actual warfare. You know, people often say, well, Sweden has now joined, Finland has now joined, so we are not so dependent on whether the Suwalki gap is open or closed. But the question is, how can we move, for instance, troops from Sweden to Estonia? We have to have full control over the Baltic Sea, or this part of the Baltic Sea, to guarantee their security and safety. And this takes massive capabilities. One of the problems also in the Baltic Sea region is that NATO ships, with the exception of German ships, I would say, quite rarely come here. I mean, it's surprising, but this kind of heritage of the Warsaw Pact lake has remained in a sense that NATO countries are not used to moving around in the Baltic space. There are occasional visits here and there are certain exercises, but let's compare it to the Mediterranean, for instance. The NATO presence in the Mediterranean is massive. It's historically massive. It's massive today. In the Baltic Sea, you don't see anything like that. Of course, Finland and Sweden are now in NATO, so these are NATO ships, these are NATO countries. But bringing in, for instance, Americans, bringing in Brits to show their flag would be extremely important. And finally, on Americans, with the Baltic states, the biggest risk is so-called no-notice or short-notice scenarios, meaning that we are so small that an action without particular warning time would be implemented against us by Russians. One of the ways, the only way to confront that, is a massive US participation with various means which are in the US disposal. So actually, if we talk about the Baltic Sea and the Baltic Sea region, then we cannot talk only about the countries neighboring our sea. It's really the role of the United States, the presence of the United States, which makes a lot of difference. So what happens in DC today has direct relevance of how peacefully we can live here on the Baltic Sea.
Admiral, you agree?
Yeah, no, not entirely. Well, actually, we should all be aware that that priorities might change for good reason, and that at a certain moment the priorities change to the Pacific, and thus we have to take our fair share here, and we're willing to do that. Now, when it comes to participation of non-Baltic Sea nations, I think we see quite some substance in that. Look at Baltops, 50 ships from different nations, over 4,000 people. Northern Coast, our own exercise, 30 ships, 3,000 people. Every unit that is coming into the Baltic Sea and that is not from the area sees the area as a challenge. It's confined, it's shallow, you have Russians running around, they are approaching you by less than 500 yards. So what we're doing is, for every ship that comes in, they get a full in-brief one day in Rostock about latest intelligence, about how to operate in confined and shallow waters, and also how to operate in the vicinity of Russian ships with the aim of do not escalate by default. I think that's also important, but I cannot say that we do not see many foreign ships, so to say, in the Baltic Sea. We see the VJTF regularly, and that's a NATO commitment. And we see other nations coming in there frequently as well, and the JEF.
Just going back to what Yuri said in regards to lessons learned or lesson identified from the Ukraine war, and especially with emphasis on the Black Sea. I mean, you could make a case, of course, that due to autonomous systems and long-range strike capabilities, that the time for surface competence would be past. I don't buy into that. I think the future is going to be including both autonomous and traditional operated vessels. And I mean, when we have advanced platforms, we can handle this. Several of us are engaged into Operation Aspides and prosperity guardians in the Red Sea. And yes, we are exposed to quite advanced cruise missiles and drones there, but the Houthis has not been successful in taking out any of the naval ships that are there. So I think the future is going to be more autonomous indeed. We are investing into autonomous systems below the surface, on the surface, and I see others, but it's also going to be traditional surface competence, and you're going to have that mixed fleet in the future, I think.
Peter, would you like to add anything, or should I take another question?
I think I'll just weigh in and say, yes, we need the US here for the time being, but we would be wise to invest in being able to look after the Baltic Seas ourselves, because I wouldn't count on the US being around in 10, 15 years.
Or even 6 months. No. Question, I'll take one from the back, the gentleman with glasses, and then the man with the yellow shirt in the back.
Hello, Shota Guineria, Baltic Defense College. So Swedish and Finnish membership was the mother of all unintended consequences, let's say, of Russia's
Unless you were
invasion
Paul
of
Jonsson,
Ukraine.
he intended it for decades.
Yeah, and there are two clear lessons that we can apply to other parts of the Atlantic. One is that even for the stronger countries, and not only for the vulnerable countries, NATO membership today is the only security guarantee. And the second is that Russia's hostile rhetoric against, NATO enlargement or expansion, as they call it, is more of a bark than a bite. And once they realize that it's irreversible, basically there is very little they can do about it. So isn't it the time to retire this argument that NATO enlargement is escalatory or provocative, and look at it as something that can stabilize the regions, really, as we have seen in the Baltics, because Baltic-Nordic region is now more secure than it was before. So,
That's
and
your
could
question?
we apply
Because
specifically?
I think we just go, they'll all say yes, and then we move on.
Yeah,
I mean,
just one. No.
Quick
Just
question,
a question.
please.
Yes, could we apply this approach to the Black Sea too? Because Black Sea could become a NATO lake even before the Baltic Sea if Ukraine and Georgia would materialize this, let's say, Bucharest summit promise. So now, isn't it the time to take NATO enlargement as the only way to secure the regions more seriously, or not?
I mean, this is the linchpin of the European security order, that all countries and all people should have the right to choose their own path to security if they want to be part of EU and NATO. And I mean, Russia want to reverse that. That was the Lavrov letters from the 2000, December 17th, 2021. And, that was the tipping point for Sweden and Finland. It was a very easy choice for me because I'm a hardcore Atlanticist, who think that the world is much better when the Europe and the North America cooperates. But I think it was the final mechanism for people who were dubious about the NATO membership to say, oh, okay, so Russia doesn't think we're free countries any longer who have the right to choose, because there will be no NATO, further NATO enlargements. And I mean, if you want to have access to Article 5, if you want to have access to NATO's common defense planning, you have to understand that NATO supports its partners but defends its allies. So I mean, this is the conclusion that we reached.
you can hope, you can wish.
You can even assume that you might be supporting in case of a crisis, but you cannot know. And I mean, I always say that blood is thicker than water, and even the Swedes, we get it, and we took the necessary measures to join the alliance. And I'm very glad we did it in a bipartisan matters. When we had the inauguration and we had the flag ceremony, there was 6 out of 8 party leaders who actually came to Brussels, and that shows a strong unity within the Swedish political systems. And I'm the first to take my hat off for those who change their minds, because I'm a politician myself, and I know the most difficult thing to do in politics is changing your mind. So I'd be glad to take my hat off for the Social Democrats there, and I think it's good. They can change your mind.
Okay, question from the back. I don't think there's any
Great,
other.
thank you. Richard Scholes, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Parliament of Latvia. Just coming back, reflecting what Peter said, that when it comes to Russia, we have to be resilient and play out different scenarios. Well, this is not modus operandi for Putin. His modus operandi is very clear. Act, and only then to observe, see that there is no action, and act again and again and again. So therefore, this kind of policy should be very clear. Let's prepare for the worst, absolute worst. We are in the worst scenario already. There is a war in Europe, and that should be put on a plate. So the questions are here. So the first question is, countermeasures, counteroffensive right now when it comes to GPS signal blocking.
Thank you.
We're
for
not
asking that.
doing anything at all. Actually, Finland is closing airport just because there's one access
it
plane.
now.
And last question, the best one. The NATO Navy base in Baltic Sea, and why exactly Liepāja? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I guess you could say that now that they're beefing up their navigational system in Tartu and making sure that you can land even without GPS, that's a response. It's enhancing resilience to deny that type of attack. So that's one way of doing it. I hear you're saying it's not enough, but that's an important part of it, to make it harder and harder for these attacks to succeed.
I would call it
there's no deterrent to that, though.
observe, endure, and recover. So there are measures that you can. I mean, look, I had ships in near Lebanon that were heavily jammed, and by using different means of communication, so new satellite systems, we were overcoming the whole thing. So there are technical solutions to overcome it, but you can't work actively against it. So.
How worried is Sweden about this, Paul?
We said it on the record as well. We're concerned. Of course, there are alternative systems. This is something that's been going on for a long time in the region, just so we know it. We see it popping up sometimes, quite frequently during the last 1 year, and we are concerned. We state that on the record as well, and there are technical solutions how to handle this as well, and this could be directed things that you want to, and it could be results of exercises and activities. But it's of course a concern if you have jamming against the GPS, and it puts things at the risks, even though there are alternative systems for example, civilian airliners and so forth. But
and Jyri, since Tartu was specifically one of those in trouble, but it's not only that you can find a way around it. I mean, and we're not talking only about the GPS jamming. Of course, Russian planes turn off their transponders constantly. This has been a problem NATO's been dealing with since long before these kind of things escalated during the war.
I mean, for Estonia, it's a big problem, and as you said, we closed temporarily Tartu airport because planes were not able to land there. Civilian planes were not able to land there. I mean, there are two approaches to hybrid. One is you increase your resilience, and these measures were pointed out. The other is you threaten or exercise countermeasures. Do we have capabilities, I mean, we as an alliance, to exercise countermeasures when it comes to spoofing, when it comes to scrambling GPS signal? Of course, it's not so complicated as such, but as stopping the ships, this is a political decision. There are consequences. There are always unintended consequences. So it's a matter of making this call.
Okay, yes, take one there.
Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. And I think my question is directed principally to Peter. I find it very difficult when you talk about the prospect of escalation in relation to stopping any oil flows. The oil flows through the Baltic and Black Sea are the absolute revenue windpipe of the Russian state. If we put any control system, perhaps the gentleman from the Kiev School of Economics idea looks quite attractive, even we start with that, that puts an entire risk profile on the Russians. If they even contemplate then doing any of the things you suggest as escalation, then we will tighten clearly those access to those oil flows. So rather than being escalation, it gives us a tremendous capacity for an effective countermeasure against any threat that they may contemplate in the future, any potential retaliation. So it's actually lowering escalation rather than surely rising it, because at the end of the day, they need those oil revenues. And our control of those oil revenues, or our ability to control it, gives us an enormous degree of leverage over the Russian state. That surely is a correct way of looking at those revenue flows. That's my question.
But who's we, though? I mean, are you talking about national governments, like asking the Danes to do it? I mean, this was one of my questions. On whose head does this fall?
The point about this is that there are a whole range of different ways of looking at this. You can look at this as a response to environmental issues, and you can create a legal structure around that where a number of states will be able to do this. You could look at it in terms of the suggestion from the gentleman from the Kiev School of Economics. The point about it is you can create a number of different structures to deal with this. And the legal arguments here, the whole point about this is that we've never had to deal with hybrid war on this scale in world history before. And public international law develops from practice and from the needs of states. And you work out from there to create a structure to deal with this. But we create some form of structure, perhaps minimal, perhaps starting with the Kiev proposal. And then you create a structure which allows you to stand on the Russians' revenue windpipe. And that gives you the leverage. And that's my point.
Thank you. But I think we already answered that. Does anybody have something to add? I mean, it's a really important issue.
I was basically just trying to say that we have a response problem, and as we just heard, it's a political question as to whether you want to do it or not. And I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that you can say that, but then it becomes legal, and then we have escalation dominance. But that's not true. You still have to think through what the Russians are likely to do, and they're not just going to say, so we'll just stop.
No, but
sorry, I'm not going to give you the floor anymore. There's a lot of people with their hands up. All right, one person here, this lady, and one of my favorites, Ian Bond. Okay, so now I'm getting into dangerous territory on time, so I will take these three. Please make them short.
Yes, Tom O'Donnell, the Wilson Center, but I work in Berlin. What Ben and Alan said here.
Short.
The elephant in the room here is that if you don't do something, the Ukrainians have demonstrated they can hit Primorsk, they can hit Ust-Luga, and they can hit Novorossiysk and cut out 60% of Russian exports. They've demonstrated that. The other elephant in the room that I'd like you to speak to is when Nord Stream was destroyed, was cut, immediately, I asked Norwegians and Ukrainians that, the highest level in the gas sector, and before I could get the question out of my mind, they said, force majeure. This is all about force majeure. Putin, all the silly things he did, claiming about he had excuses with the compressors and all this, was to get force majeure to cut it off.
Okay, so the question,
my question is this: based on that, you end up seizing all the, Russia would be responsible for having to nationalize the, German gas firms and so forth. So what I don't understand is outside the business, I don't hear this talked about.
So what's your question?
Is this true? Is this a question of force majeure that would allow you in the long run, if they lose in Stockholm in the arbitration court, you'd end up seizing their property all over the world where a jurisdiction would agree?
Okay. Question, yes. I'm sorry to be so strict, but it's a very interesting panel and we want to talk a lot more.
I'll be brief. Olga Oliker, Crisis Group. What current or prospective NATO Baltic Sea capability do you think worries the Russians the most, and how can that be leveraged?
Super secret. Ian?
Hi, Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform in London. There have been a couple of mentions of the Joint Expeditionary Force.
Not nearly enough, evidently, right?
Well, three of the four panelists are from countries that are members of the GEF. So I have one question to them and one to Admiral Kark. The question to them is, what's the role of the GEF now that all of its members are also members of NATO? Because it was originally kind of a bridge between NATO and non-NATO countries. And to the Admiral, given that Germany is not a member of the GEF, how does Germany see the GEF, and is there a scope for cooperation between Germany and the GEF? And does it plug into NATO?
Paul, do you want to take that first?
Well, in regards to the GEF, of course, now all of us are allies, and it made it a little bit easier with sharing intelligence. Before, we used to have this releasable to Sweden and Finland. We can also make sure that we coordinate the GEF activities much closer to to NATO's regional plans. I think it's conducive in that regard. When we activated GPRO, we made sure that that's the activities of the Joint Expeditionary Force that took place in November. During the 3 weeks, we increased the naval presence in the Baltic Sea due to the Baltic Connector. Then we made sure, of course, this was done in very close dialogue with SACEUR, because SACEUR undertook vigilance activities, taking in NATO assets. So you know, we complement each other. What is JEF useful? It's useful for two things. First is to operate under the threshold of Article 5. The other thing is that the JEF can be quick. It can come into the Baltic Sea region before the alliance, a la 32, have made decisions. So I think those are some of the merits of the JEF. We appreciate it having a focus on Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea, and that it has a strong maritime component as well. And we appreciate, of course, the United Kingdom being very much engaged into Northern Europe, both with the Northern Group, which we are all engaged into. Then we have the JEF, and of course the activities is taking place here in Estonia, having the lead for the battle group as well. So.
For the JEF?
Sure, or I mean also about the force majeure question, and I'm going to save your question to be our final round because that's a really good one and I hadn't thought of it. I'll steal it. Okay.
So for the JEF, we have not chosen to become member because it's our opinion that our security is best served concentrating on one, and that's NATO, understanding NATO forces, and my personal view distracts a bit from what NATO is doing. However, it's good to have them in the area if they are there. Now we need to better coordinate, and I just had a very thorough discussion with the First Sea Lord for the coming time when we stand up the headquarters, that we at least coordinate what's going on and perhaps integrate into NATO activities like the exercises we have, so then we could bring our forces together, and that would call for a better cooperation then as well.
Okay, Yuri, anything on the JEF or on?
Well, we highly value JEF, and we don't see much of a contradiction between NATO and JEF. JEF is one of the tools. It's a multinational tool. NATO actually has many multinational units of different size and shape under its command. It can be used independently from NATO. It can be used in NATO framework. For instance, one of the issues, one of the policy areas JEF is good at is really the issues of protecting underwater infrastructure, and I think we can use it more and more and develop this tool. So I see a great perspective. Now we are coming back to this stopping the ships, force majeure, etc., etc. I mean, let's be honest. We are talking about NATO sea, a NATO lake.
Even if we don't like it.
Even if we don't like it. If there is a multinational agreement between big NATO countries, small NATO countries, medium-sized NATO countries, if there is serious collision which has weight, then of course these issues are seen in a totally different light. So I mentioned Denmark, but I cannot ask Denmark to be responsible for stopping the ships. I'm sure countries will do it only if they know that the whole Atlantic community is behind them. So that's the dilemma at the moment. Thanks.
And do we see, Peter, just
about
give you a chance on
well,
that?
it's a short gap measure to address problems that will eventually be solved by other means. We do have a response problem right now in closing the gap until NATO is able to act collectively. But again, if you look at the resources that the NATO nations around the Baltic Sea actually has, and if you look at the way they're currently spending money, we should be able to deal with that ourselves without British assistance. And I would much rather have the British Navy engaged in the North Atlantic, looking at the DRK gap and further up.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. No, I have said all. Okay, yes, sir. We have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
No, you don't have 10 minutes. We, as a collective organization, have 10 minutes here.
Very briefly,
No.
Alar Oljum from the European External Action Service. Two countries have not been mentioned yet here. One is China, and the other is Poland. I'm asking about China because the Baltic Connector, there was a Chinese ship. Does China have any role in the Baltic Sea?
That's a good question.
One way or another. Poland is the country which is spending a lot, more than 4%. What are they bringing to the table as far as naval capacity and ambition in the Baltic Sea? Thank you.
Good question. Poland, Admiral? Did Poland not maybe want to also have a...
Well, actually, they offered to provide a regional headquarters as well, but we came to an agreement that for the time being it should be us, because we're already working a lot of issues in that respect, and in 28 we'll make an assessment of how we proceed in that respect. With the Polish Navy is an old and proud navy with good capabilities, and they are investing heavily now to become more relevant and much better. And whatever we can do there in cooperating with them and helping them to come up to speed, especially with submarine force, will be, we will do.
You're heading it off to the Shangri-La Forum, so you could give us a preview of the
well, that's the
with
China question. Just to address the Polish question, of course, Poland right now put on the tender of procuring submarines. Well, we welcome if we have more submarines in the Baltic Sea. I mean, it's Germany and Sweden now predominantly are operating them, and if we can have more these electric submarines, it's good. If we can have the same kind of platforms, we can also have a high level of interoperability. We can do joint training and so forth, just as the Swedish and the German navies collaborating very closely. They also acquired from Sweden 2 signal intelligence ships as well, and we're operating similar platforms. And when we have this kind of platform commonalities, it enhances interoperabilities and possibilities to collaborate when it comes to logistics and maintenance. Then in regard to China, I think they undertook some exercise in the Baltic Sea a few years ago. I would categorize this more as political fireworks than building military capabilities. I think what we are following Chinese activities is predominantly up in the Arctic, of course, where they are increasingly active as well and calling themselves a near Arctic state and so forth. And of course, the interconnectedness between the Arctic and the high north and the Baltic Sea is a given, which I think there's an increasing awareness among all the countries in this region.
Another reason there was a lot of relief about getting the Swedish territory in there. Peter, what do you think about the Chinese influence?
Well, I don't see them having much of a role inside the Baltic Sea. My main concern is also the Arctic Ocean, where they're going to try and steal all the fish as soon as they can get rid of it, unless we do something about it. You will see how they are operating with their fishing fleets across the world, and that's going to be an issue in the Arctic as well, if we don't get our act together.
But how does that happen, briefly?
What do you mean?
Who's we and who's got to get their act together?
The Arctic nations.
Yeah, but through the Arctic Council or through the European Union, through NATO?
That's just one forum where you can hold meetings and talk. You need to actually look at the countries that have some capability, and then they'll have to figure it out among themselves. Where they meet is not really that important. It's more that they address the issue, which is going to be serious as the ice melts.
Poise, presence, naval diplomacy, being active in the region, being present, coordinating with the countries that are relevant in this. I mean, Denmark, Iceland, all the Nordics as well. I think those are some of the keys. But, you know, if you withdraw all your assets and capabilities, you create vacuums, and other actors are going to be predominant there instead. So,
yes.
Just on China, I mean, for the Chinese, the relationship with the Baltic Sea, region at the moment is predominantly regarding trade. And of course, for Russia and for China, it is an important relationship when it comes to Russian-Chinese trade relationship, which is crucial for Russian war effort. So in that sense, this route of, for instance, the new Polar Bear, the ship which destroyed, Chinese ship which destroyed the Baltic Connector, is a good sign of what is the crucial importance of Chinese-Russian transport corridor. And of course, because it has strategic importance, it also has strategic importance when it comes to security, both for Russia and for China. And more, it is also related to the fact that you can use the passage through the northern passage to move ships to the Baltic region with the shortest possible time frame, which again is very useful both strategically and commercially.
And Paul, you're going to be speaking. You're going to have discussions with Asian partners. I mean, NATO is increasingly doing that as well.
Sure.
Do you find these productive when you talk about how it would be really nice if they didn't drop anchors in Baltic waters and things like this?
Yeah, well, I think the week after next, I think we're 5 or 6 defense ministers from the EU. I think also other representatives who are going to Shangri-La Dialogue, and a few of us also went last year. And I think that the case we want to make is the close interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic area and the Indo-Pacific area, which is crucial. We're drafting an Indo-Pacific strategy actually in Sweden, and I know Germany, I know of course the Netherlands, the EU has an Indo-Pacific strategy, so I think we get it. We also have to be involved there because we have strong vested interest when it comes to sea lines of communications, when it comes to trade, and when it comes to freedom of navigation. But I think most of all we're going to be trying to convey the message that supporting Ukraine is also about standing up for a rules-based international order, which should be a universal value, if you ask me as well, not just a Euro-Atlantic value. So.
Well, not to be rude, but I didn't ask what you were going to tell them. I asked how they were going to receive it and whether you were going to make progress with this.
I don't think I'm going to be meeting my Chinese counterpart at the Shangri-La.
But there will be, the Chinese defense minister will be there this time.
I would assume so, and Secretary Austin and many others as well.
Interesting, okay.
I'm also continuing afterwards to Australia, which we're collaborating closely with, and Singapore, of course, because they're operating in Swedish submarines, both Australia and Singapore. So it's a dimension of our bilateral relationships in the maritime domain.
Okay.
But it's absolutely helpful to interconnect the different areas of the world. I mean, what's happening in the South China Sea might happen in our backyard as well. Yeah. China declaring itself a near-Arctic nation, questioning international law and the rules-based order. That could easily happen in other areas as well. As Sweden, we have published our Indo-Pacific guidelines, and since 21 we are supporting that with military forces. So this year, just 2 weeks ago, 2 ships are on a tour around the world through the South China Sea, training, exercising with partners, but basically underlining we stand in for the international rules-based order. And that's necessary.
Okay, so we are now down to just the last moments, and Ilya asked what should Russia be most worried about. I was going to have a much more boring question and just say what is the most important of the new capabilities, but let's put those 2 questions together as our final round. Yuri, I'll start on your end. What do you as NATO have now that really should be worrisome to the Kremlin that you didn't have before Finland and Sweden came in?
Well, Finland and Sweden, obviously, their decision to join is absolutely positive in every sense. Obviously, the Finnish border adds 1,300 kilometers to the NATO border, but I don't think it's a problem. I mean, it's more a kind of a theoretical aspect of just looking at the map. There are certain center points, certain focus points, which are, of course, of importance. Now, if you look at it from the Russian side, I think it's fair to say that they are not so worried about the kind of southern Finland. They are more worried about northern Finland. They are more worried about Sweden and Finland as NATO countries coming to Arctics. And of course, potentially, in the Russian mind, threatening their most important capability, which is their strategic nuclear capability, the strategic subs. So this is really the key concern for Russians. And we will see soon, with a build-up of troops, even during the Ukrainian war, to sort of, in a way, protect the ports for the nuclear submarines. When it comes to the Baltics, then the most important part for Russia is clearly the trade routes, the international waters, especially now that the West writ large has closed many of the land borders. The sea, the access to the international waters from the Finnish Bay is of enormous strategic importance for Russia, and they're obviously concerned that for whatever reasons, this route, the smooth sailing on this route will be hampered. Does it give us any pressure points? Well, we were discussing the Baltic Sea, we were discussing the tankers, but this is all theoretical. I don't think we can go into too deep of an analysis here
yet
from the stage.
Admiral, you've got a lot more capabilities. What's most important? And you said the Russian Navy is going to come out stronger, so...
but I can fully subscribe to what has been said. I would say what would be frightening for me if I was on the other side, this proper integration now of nearly all countries around, and better alignment of our forces in the area that puts a dilemma to our adversary.
Okay.
Well, I think that the three focus areas are, of course, the Bay of Finland. I think it's the Gdansk Bay, as they call that, side of Poland, and it's the strait between Denmark and Sweden. What I only could add to bringing capabilities, also our integration into the air and missile defense systems inside the alliance, as well as the EAMD as well. And sometimes when we look at naval forces, we think of them as midway and traditional sea battles, but also remember how important these vessels are for extended air defense systems as well, both on a higher level and a mid-range as well. So when we're thinking air defense, and that's a lesson learned from the war in Ukraine, because the Russians has indeed developed their cruise missiles and their ballistic missiles as well, and scaling up production. And for us to get a stronger air defense is very much in Sweden also connected with naval capabilities, not just ground-based air defense systems.
So in wargaming, the red team always used to, in addition to the Suwałki Gap, they would seize Gotland first. Would they be deterred now?
In wargaming, we always win, but I'm not going to say how they play out. I mean, we put a lot of emphasis on strengthening our footprint on the island of Gotland.
Well, you put a few weapons back there and some soldiers.
No, we established a regiment. We have a battle group with combined arms. We're investing into it as well. We have a home guard battalion, and we're going to be increasing international collaboration also on the island of Gotland. I mean, controlling Gotland is critical for the whole alliance as well. So we sleep well at night in regard to Gotland, and we made a number of measures in order to preserve our ability to defend the island.
To restore your ability.
We
can't argue about it. But it's true. You completely demilitarized Scotland, but we don't have time. Peter, last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were Russian, I would be most worried about the U.S. pivot to the Nordic countries, in the sense they're now getting basing in all four countries, and a lot of it very close to the Kola Peninsula. So, well, that's not really good news for the Russians. Now we're really, really close to their most strategic base.
So if you would just take the crude money out of their pockets, they would really have a lot more to worry about. But anyway, I think we had a great discussion on that. I hope Benjamin was happy with that. Thank you so much to our engaged audience. I'm so happy. I was worried there would be an empty room because the evening sessions are so good, but thank you so much for showing up, being so engaged. And thank you to my panelists. You guys were fantastic. And thank you to LMC for having us.